moment of miracle as though their hearts would break. Perhaps it was the pure air from the snows before him. Perhaps it was the memory that brushed him for a moment of the poem that bade him raise his eyes to the helpful hills. At all events, he felt at peace. Then his glance fell upon the bridge, and at that moment a twanging noise filled the air, as when the string of some musical instrument snaps in a disused room, and he saw the bridge divide and fling 5 gesticulating ants into the valley below. Anyone else would have said to himself with secret joy, "Within 10 minutes myself." But it was another thought that visited Brother Juniper. Why did this happen to those 5? If there were any plan in the universe at all, if there were any pattern in a human life, surely it could be discovered mysteriously latent in those lives so suddenly cut off. Either we live by accident and die by accident, or we live by plan and die by plan. And on that instant, Brother Juniper made the resolve to inquire into the secret lives of those 5 persons, that moment falling through the air, and to surprise the reason of their taking off. It seemed to Brother Juniper that it was high time for theology to take its place among the exact sciences, and he had long intended putting it there. What he had lacked hitherto was a laboratory. Oh, there had never been any lack of specimens. Any number of his charges had met calamity. Spiders had stung them, their lungs had been touched, their houses had burned down, and things had happened to their children from which one averts the mind. But these occasions of human woe had never been quite fit for scientific examination. They had lacked what our good savants were later to call proper control. The accident had been dependent upon human error, for example, or had contained elements of probability. But this collapse of the bridge of San Luis Rey was a sheer act of God. It afforded a perfect laboratory. You and I can see that coming from anyone but Brother Juniper, this plan would be the flower of a perfect skepticism. It resembled the effort of those presumptuous souls who wanted to walk on the pavements of heaven and built the Tower of Babel to get there. But to our Franciscan, there was no element of doubt in the experiment. He knew the answer. He merely wanted to prove it, historically, mathematically, to his converts. Poor, obstinate converts, so slow to believe that their pains were inserted into their lives for their own good. People were always asking for good, sound proofs. Doubt springs eternal in the human breast, even in countries where the Inquisition can read your very thoughts in your eyes. This was not the first time that Brother Juniper had tried to resort to such methods. Often on the long trips he had to make, scurrying from parish to parish, his robe tucked up about his knees for haste, he would fall to dreaming of experiments that justify the ways of God to man. For instance, a complete record of the prayers for rain and their results. Often he had stretched his arms to the sky and declaimed the splendid ritual. Not often, but several times, he had felt the virtue enter him and seen the little cloud forming on the horizon. But there were many times when weeks went by. But why think of them? It was not himself he was trying to convince that rain and drought were wisely apportioned. Thus it was that the determination rose within him at the moment of the accident. It prompted him to busy himself for 6 years, knocking at all the doors in Lima, asking thousands of questions, filling scores of notebooks in his effort at establishing the fact that each of the 5 lost lives was a perfect whole. Everyone knew that he was working on some sort of memorial of the accident, and everyone was very helpful and misleading. A few even knew the principal aim of his activity, and there were patrons in high places. The result of all this diligence was an enormous book, which, as we shall see later, was publicly burned on a beautiful spring morning in the great square. But there was a secret copy, and after a great many years and without much notice, it found its way to the library of the University of San Marco. There it lies between two great wooden covers, collecting dust in a cupboard. It deals with one after another of the victims of the accident, cataloging thousands of little facts and anecdotes and testimonies, and concluding with a dignified passage describing why God had settled upon that person and upon that day for his demonstration of wisdom. Yet, for all his diligence, Brother Juniper never knew the central passion of Doña Maria's life, nor of Uncle Pio's, not even of Esteban's. And I, who claim to know so much more, isn't it possible that even I have missed the very spring within the spring? Some say that we shall never know, and that to the gods we are like the flies that the boys kill on a summer day. And some say, on the contrary, that the very sparrows do not lose a feather that has not been brushed away by the finger of God. Part 2. The Marquesa de Montemayor. Any Spanish schoolboy is required to know today more about Doña Maria, Marquesa de Montemayor, than Brother Juniper was to discover in years of research. Within a century of her death, her letters had become one of the monuments of Spanish literature, and her life and times have ever since been the object of long studies. But her biographers have erred in one direction as greatly as the Franciscan did in another. They have tried to invest her with a host of graces, to read back into her life and person some of the beauties that abound in her letters, whereas all real knowledge of this wonderful woman must proceed from the act of humiliating her and of divesting her of all beauties save one. She was the daughter of a cloth merchant who had acquired the money and the hatred of the Limeans within a stone's throw of the plaza. Her childhood was unhappy, she was ugly, she stuttered. Her mother persecuted her with sarcasms in an effort to arouse some social charms, and forced her to go about the town in a veritable harness of jewels. She lived alone, and she thought alone. Many suitors presented themselves, but as long as she could, she fought against the convention of her time and was determined to remain single. There were hysterical scenes with her mother, recriminations, screams, and slamming of doors. At last, at 26, she found herself penned into marriage with a supercilious and ruined nobleman, and the Cathedral of Lima fairly buzzed with the sneers of her guests. Still she lived alone, and thought alone, and when an exquisite daughter was born to her, she fastened upon her an idolatrous love. But little Clara took after her father. She was cold and intellectual. At the age of 8, she was calmly correcting her mother's speech, and presently regarding her with astonishment and repulsion. The frightened mother became meek and obsequious, but she could not prevent herself from persecuting Doña Clara with nervous attention and a fatiguing love. Again, there were hysterical recriminations, screams, and slamming of doors. From the offers of marriage that fell to her, Doña Clara deliberately chose the one that required her removal to Spain. So to Spain she went, to that land from which it takes 6 months to receive an answer to one's letter. The leave-taking before so long a voyage became in Peru one of the formal services of the church. The ship was blessed, and as the space widened between the vessel and the beach, both companies knelt and sang a hymn that never failed to sound weak and timid, in all that open air. Doña Clara sailed with most admirable composure, leaving her mother to gaze after the bright ship, her hand pressing now her heart and now her mouth. Blurred and streaked became her view of the serene Pacific and the enormous clouds of pearl that hang forever motionless above it. Left alone in Lima, the Marquesa's life grew more and more inward. She became increasingly negligent in her dress, and like all lonely people, she talked to herself audibly. All her existence lay in the burning center of her mind. On that stage were performed endless dialogues with her daughter, impossible reconciliations, scenes eternally recommenced of remorse and forgiveness. On the street you beheld an old woman, her red wig fallen a little over one ear, her left cheek angry with a leprous affection, her right with a complimentary adjustment of rouge. Her chin was never dry, her lips were never still. Lima was a city of eccentrics, but even there she became its jest as she drove through the streets or shuffled up the steps of its churches. She was thought to be continuously drunk. Worse things were said of her, and petitions were afloat that she be locked up. She had been denounced 3 times before the Inquisition. It is not impossible that she might have been burned had her son-in-law been less influential in Spain, and had she not somehow collected a few friends about the viceregal court who suffered her for her oddity and her wide reading. The distressing character of the relations between mother and daughter were further embittered by misunderstandings over money. The Condesa received a handsome allowance from her mother and frequent gifts. Doña Clara soon became the outstanding woman of intelligence at the Spanish court. All the wealth of Peru would have been insufficient to maintain her in the grandiose style she fancied for herself. Strangely enough, her extravagance proceeded from one of the best traits in her nature. She regarded her friends, her servants, and all the interesting people in the capital as her children. In fact, there seemed only one person in the world towards whom she did not expend herself in kind offices. Among her protégés was the cartographer de Blasius, whose maps of the New World was dedicated to the Marquesa de Montemayor, amid the roars of the courtiers at Lima, who read that she was the admiration of her city and a rising sun in the west. Another was the scientist Aquarius, whose treatise on the laws of hydraulics was suppressed by the Inquisition as being too exciting. For a decade, the Condesa literally sustained all the arts and sciences of Spain. It was not her fault that nothing memorable was produced in that time. About 4 years after Doña Clara's departure, Doña Maria received her permission to visit Europe. On both sides, the visit was anticipated with resolutions well nourished on self-reproach, the one to be patient, the other to be undemonstrative. Both failed. Each tortured the other, and was on the point of losing her mind under the alternations of self-rebuke and the outbursts of passion. At length one day Doña Maria rose before dawn, daring no more than to kiss the door behind which her daughter was sleeping, took ship, and returned to America. Henceforth letter-writing had to take the place of all the affection that could not be lived. Hers were the letters that in an astonishing world have become the textbook of schoolboys and the ant-hill of the grammarians. Doña Maria would have invented her genius had she not been born with it, so necessary was it to her love that she attract the attention, perhaps the admiration, of her distant child. She forced herself to go out into society in order to cull its ridicules. She taught her eye to observe. She read the masterpieces of her language to discover its effects. She insinuated herself into the company of those who were celebrated for their conversation. Night after night in her Baroque palace, she wrote.
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it, at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.